Hey there. Get ready to dive into the incredible world of evolution. You've sent over some fascinating material from educational standards, and I'm ready to dig in. What's cool is we're not just going to learn the basics. We're going to uncover how scientists actually think about evolution, like the processes behind it.
Exactly. These sources offer a really interesting lens. They push us to see the direct link between a changing environment and how species change over time.
Okay, so let's unpack that. I'm all about analogies. So is it fair to say the environment is like a sculptor kind of shaping which traits help a species succeed?
I like that analogy. Think about a species environment gradually shifting. Maybe a new competitor shows up for resources or the climate starts to warm. This creates what we call selection pressure. It's like the environment is raising the bar for survival. Only those individuals with traits best suited to these new conditions will thrive.
So it's not like animals are consciously choosing to evolve, right? It's more like the environment sets the stage and only those who happen to have the right, costume for that particular play get to pass on those traits.
That's a great way to put it. It's all about subtle shifts over generations, not sudden transformations. And these shifts can lead to some amazing adaptations. Did you know that the introduction of the tamarisk plant to the Colorado River actually impacted other species populations?
Really? See, I'm not familiar with this tamarisk plant. How did that happen?
Well, the tamarisk is incredibly well suited to the Colorado River's environment, but their success came at a cost for native plants like willows and cottonwoods. Because they were so successful, they outcompeted these native species for resources, leading to a decline in the willow and cottonwood populations.
Wow, so the tamarisk essentially reshaped the environment in a way that made it tougher for those other trees to survive. It's like a domino effect.
Exactly. And sometimes these environmental changes can be so dramatic that they split one species into two. Take the kaibab and abert squirrels. Their story is a perfect illustration of this.
Wait, did you say separated squirrels? Now that's a story I need to hear.
Picture the Grand Canyon, a massive natural barrier. Millions of years ago, there was just one squirrel species living in that area. But as the canyon deepened over time, it divided the squirrel population into two isolated groups.
That they were literally cut off from each other. Like
Mhm.
Romeo and Juliet, but with squirrels in a really big ditch.
Exactly. The kaibab squirrels found themselves on the north rim, while the abert squirrels ended up on the south rim. Over time, each group adapted to their specific environments, even developing slightly different characteristics. Today, they're considered distinct species.
So the Grand Canyon basically orchestrated its own evolution experiment.
Precisely, and it perfectly illustrates the concept of speciation. Geographic isolation, combined with the need to adapt to different resources and conditions, can lead to the incredible process of new species emerging.
That's mind-blowing. Okay, I have to ask, how do scientists piece together these evolutionary puzzles? It seems like detective work on a massive scale.
It is a bit like detective work. Scientists use all sorts of clues to piece together the history of life on Earth, from fossils to DNA analysis. But when it comes to understanding those big picture evolutionary relationships, they use fascinating models like cladograms and phylogenetic trees.
Okay, those sound kind of intimidating, like something you'd find scribbled on a scientist's chalkboard. What can you tell us about these models?
Well, they might sound complicated, but they're actually visual tools that help scientists organize and understand how different species are related to one another. Think of a family tree, but instead of tracing back your aunts, uncles, and cousins, it's showing the connections between, well, all living things, really.
So instead of memorizing a million facts about every species, scientists can look at these diagrams and see the big picture of how everything is connected.
Exactly. And one of the most famous examples of these models in action involves those iconic birds. Darwin's finches, the ones with all the different beaks from the Galapagos Islands?
Oh, absolutely. Darwin's finches are practically poster birds for evolution. But how does those models you mentioned, the cladograms and phylogenetic trees, help us understand how all those different beaks evolved?
That's a great question. So Darwin observed all these finch species on the Galapagos Islands, and what struck him was how each species had a beak perfectly adapted to its specific food source. Some had strong, thick beaks for cracking tough seeds, others had long, thin beaks for probing flowers, and some even had beaks adapted for using tools to extract insects. Cladograms and phylogenetic trees help us visualize how those beak shapes diverged over countless generations.
So we're talking about more than just like a family resemblance, right? These models actually help show how long ago species branched off on their own evolutionary paths.
You got it. And the really interesting thing about phylogenetic trees in particular is that the length of the branches often represents time, relative time. That is, showing how much time has passed since species shared a common ancestor.
So it's like a family tree where you can see not just who is related, but also how distantly related they are.
Precisely. With Darwin's finches, these models beautifully demonstrate how one ancestral finch species likely landed on the Galapagos Islands and then, over many, many generations, diversified to fill all those different ecological niches.
Wow, it's like the finches read the environment's playbook and adapted their beaks accordingly. That's incredible. It really highlights how these seemingly simple diagrams can unlock so much about the history of life. But it all comes back to that environmental pressure we talked about earlier, right? Those beaks didn't just appear out of nowhere.
Absolutely. Those different beak shapes are a direct result of natural selection acting on variations within the finch populations. Those finches with beak shapes best suited to their island's food sources, they were the ones who survived, reproduced, and passed on those advantageous traits.
Okay, so the environment sets the stage, evolution directs the play, and those finches with the right beak costumes get to take the stage.
Exactly. And there's another critical element that makes this whole evolutionary play possible: genetic variation.
Ah, yes. Genetic variation, the spice of life. Tell me more about that. What exactly is it, and what role does it play in all of this?
So you see, within any population of organisms, there's a natural variety of genes, right? And this variation, it comes from random mutations in DNA, those tiny changes in the genetic code, and from the shuffling of genes that happens during reproduction.
So it's like a giant genetic lottery.
Yeah.
Every new generation gets a slightly different mix of traits, and some of those variations might be helpful, some might be harmful, and others might not make much of a difference at all.
Exactly. But here's where the environment comes back into play. When the environment changes, say a new predator arrives or the climate shifts, suddenly those seemingly insignificant variations can become really important.
It's like the environment is constantly testing out which variations work best. So it's not that like individual finches or squirrels are consciously choosing to evolve. It's more that those individuals with variations that give them even a slight edge in those new conditions are the ones more likely to survive and reproduce.
Precisely. They're more likely to pass on those advantageous traits to their offspring. Over time, those beneficial variations become more and more common in the population. That's natural selection at work, shaping and molding species over generations.
Okay, that makes so much sense. It's not about individuals evolving, but about populations shifting over time. And all of this amazing diversity we see in the natural world, from those specialized finch beaks to those distinct squirrel species, it all goes back to those tiny variations in the genetic code and the environment's role in deciding which ones get passed down.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that evolution, well, isn't always about creating new species or even about things always getting bigger, stronger, or faster. Sometimes it's about becoming smaller or better camouflaged or developing different behaviors. It's all about adaptation, whatever form that might take.
It's truly remarkable. Thinking about evolution in this way makes me realize that it's not some distant process from the past. It's happening all around us, all the time. And who knows what fascinating adaptations might emerge in the future as species continue to respond to our ever-changing planet.
That's a question that keeps scientists and curious minds like ours busy exploring. It's a constant source of wonder and discovery.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible deep dive into the world of evolution. It's been an eye-opening journey through time, adaptation, and the incredible power of natural selection. And for you listening, we hope this deep dive has sparked your own curiosity about the incredible diversity of life on Earth and the processes that have shaped it. Until next time, keep those minds curious and stay hungry for knowledge.